The shadow of rebellion in the sun-scorched fields of southern Italy, the seeds of one of history's most remarkable uprisings were quietly germinating. It was the 1st century BCE, a time when the Roman Republic sprawled across the Mediterranean, its legions feared, its power seemingly unshakable. Yet, beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur, a storm was brewing, a storm not of senators or generals, but of men and women forced into the harsh life of slavery. Among them rose a figure whose name would echo through the centuries: Spartacus. We often imagine the Roman world as a realm of order, discipline, and absolute authority. But behind the city's marble temples and bustling forums, the human spirit struggled against chains, both literal and figurative. The story of Spartacus is not merely a tale of battle. It is a story of resistance, courage, and the raw yearning for freedom. It is a story that reveals the fragile threads that held the vast Roman Republic together. Threads that a single determined man could almost unravel. Spartacus was more than a gladiator. He was a symbol of rebellion against the rigid social hierarchies of Rome, a figure who challenged not only the physical might of legions, but the very idea that human lives could be owned and controlled. What makes his story compelling is not simply the battles he fought, but the ingenuity, charisma, and unyielding determination he displayed in the face of overwhelming odds. His revolt, known to history as the Third Servile War, would continue to inspire for millennia, a reminder that even the mightiest empires are vulnerable to the spark of defiance. In this exploration, we will journey through the world of ancient Rome, the gladiatorial arenas where Spartacus began his rise, the treacherous hills and valleys of southern Italy where armies clashed, and the strategies and mistakes that brought him tantalizingly close to toppling the most powerful state in the world. Along the way, we will uncover the human dimensions of this epic struggle, the hopes, fears, and sheer audacity that allowed a small band of rebels to challenge Rome itself. Section 1. From Slave to Gladiator. The Early Life of Spartacus. The early life of Spartacus is shrouded in mystery, filtered through fragments of Roman accounts written decades after the events themselves. Scholars speculate that he was born in Thrace, in the northern regions of the Aegean, a land known for its fierce warriors and rugged terrain. Some suggest he may have once been a soldier, perhaps even a mercenary, familiar with the art of warfare, disciplined in combat, and possessed of a natural leadership that would later serve him in the rebellion. Others propose he was a common man, driven by survival and circumstance, to the brutal world of gladiators. What is certain is that Spartacus ended up in the gladiatorial school of Lentulus Batiatus, in Capua, one of the largest and most notorious training grounds for those condemned to fight for entertainment. Here, men were stripped of their freedom, drilled in combat, and taught to die for the amusement of spectators. Yet it was also here that Spartacus' story truly began, in the shadowed corridors of stone arenas, where chains clinked and the air smelled of sweat, blood, and fear. Gladiators were expected to fight for survival, and in many ways, they were already soldiers without an army, warriors without a cause, beyond living to see the next day. Spartacus's experience in this world was formative. He quickly distinguished himself not only for his strength and skill with weapons, but for his intelligence and calm under pressure. He observed, learned, and most crucially, began to understand the weaknesses of those who sought to control him. In 73 BCE, the moment that would ignite one of the greatest slave uprisings in history arrived. Spartacus and a small band of fellow gladiators escaped the school, using improvised weapons and sheer cunning to overpower their captors. This initial act of defiance, almost simple in its execution, was profound in its consequences. News of their escape spread like wildfire, drawing more slaves to their cause, each man and woman driven by the same yearning: freedom. What began as a desperate bid for survival quickly became a full-fledged revolt. Spartacus demonstrated remarkable strategic thinking, organizing his followers not as a mob, but as a disciplined force, capable of evading Roman authorities and mounting effective resistance. They seized tools and weapons, honed them into instruments of war, and transformed ordinary slaves into fighters capable of facing trained Roman soldiers. The movement also had a social dimension. While Roman historians often reduce the rebellion to a series of battles, it is important to remember that the revolt challenged the fundamental social order. Slavery was not only a labor system, but a moral and political institution, underpinning the wealth and power of the Republic. Spartacus's leadership questioned the legitimacy of this system, and the mere fact that hundreds and eventually thousands of slaves were willing to follow him into battle reflected deep-seated unrest that Rome had largely ignored. As the rebel force grew, Spartacus's reputation spread. Reports suggest that he possessed a commanding presence, able to inspire loyalty and courage in men who had known nothing but oppression. Unlike many leaders of rebellion, Spartacus seems to have emphasized discipline and strategy over brute force alone, understanding that to confront Rome successfully, mere numbers would not be sufficient. Intelligence, morale, and mobility became the foundation of his approach. Spartacus's early victories, including raids on towns for supplies and careful avoidance of large Roman armies, allowed his band to grow into a formidable force. Local populations were torn between fear and admiration. Some communities aided the rebels, secretly providing food and shelter, while others remained loyal to Rome. This dynamic added a layer of complexity to the conflict, as Spartacus had to navigate not only military opposition, but the delicate politics of a society caught in upheaval. It is perhaps in this period that Spartacus's legend took root. In the forests, mountains, and plains of southern Italy, the name of a man who had escaped bondage, led a growing army, and dared to challenge the most powerful state in the world, became synonymous with courage and defiance. His story is not merely a tale of battle. It is a story of ingenuity, leadership, and the enduring human desire for freedom, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. By the time Roman authorities began to fully grasp the scale of the rebellion, Spartacus had already demonstrated a singular ability to turn desperation into power, to transform slaves into soldiers, and to show the world that even the mightiest empire could be threatened by those it sought to oppress. His life, shrouded in mystery and myth, offers a profound lesson that the spark of rebellion can ignite from the smallest ember, and that courage, skill, and vision can challenge even the greatest of powers. Section 2. The First Battles and Rising Rebellion. Once Spartacus and his fellow gladiators had broken free from the confines of the Capuan training school, their survival depended on rapid movement, careful strategy, and sheer ingenuity. At first, the fledgling band numbered only a few dozen, men armed with what they could seize: kitchen knives, farm tools, and crude weapons fashioned from the ruins of their captivity. But within weeks, the number of rebels swelled into the hundreds, and soon into the thousands, as enslaved people from surrounding estates joined the cause, seeking freedom and vengeance against their Roman oppressors. The first significant clash with Roman forces came not through an elaborate plan of conquest, but through necessity. The rebels, needing food and supplies, began to raid small towns and estates. At first, these attacks were opportunistic, almost spontaneous. But Spartacus quickly saw the potential to turn them into strategic maneuvers. Every victory, however minor, strengthened the morale of his men and drew further recruits. What the Romans saw as a minor disturbance, Spartacus transformed into the foundation of a growing insurgency. Historians note that the rebels' initial victories were remarkable not just for their daring, but for their ingenuity. Spartacus employed the terrain to his advantage, leading his followers through rugged hills and forests that were difficult for the slower Roman legions to navigate. He orchestrated ambushes, used deception to mislead pursuing forces, and understood the psychological impact of surprise and unpredictability. Unlike the conventional Roman approach, which relied on rigid formations and overwhelming discipline, Spartacus's forces were fluid, adaptable, and fueled by desperation and determination. The early battles demonstrated Spartacus's extraordinary leadership. Where most enslaved revolts had been easily crushed, his force displayed remarkable organization. The rebels established rudimentary command structures, trained in combat tactics, and maintained strict discipline, a testament to Spartacus's ability to instill order amid chaos. This level of coordination allowed them not only to survive against Roman patrols, but to inflict serious defeats, capturing weapons, armor, and resources that would further bolster their growing army. One of the most striking aspects of these early victories was the psychological effect on both sides. For the Roman commanders, it was baffling to face what appeared to be a disorganized horde that consistently outmaneuvered trained soldiers. Reports suggest that Roman morale wavered as news of each rebel victory spread. For the enslaved and oppressed, Spartacus became a symbol of hope, a living embodiment of resistance that demonstrated the possibility of defying the empire. In a society built on hierarchy and subjugation, this was a revolutionary development. The idea that the enslaved could not only fight, but win against their masters. The rebels' tactics during this period reveal a keen understanding of both logistics and strategy. They avoided prolonged engagements with larger Roman forces, choosing instead to strike quickly, seize supplies, and retreat before the enemy could consolidate. This guerrilla-style warfare was revolutionary in the Roman context, where open-field battles and structured formations were the norm. Spartacus's approach relied on mobility, local knowledge, and adaptability, allowing a force of former slaves to stand toe-to-toe with professional soldiers. Several early victories stand out as defining moments in the rising rebellion. One such incident involved the seizure of a Roman consular army that underestimated the rebels' size and skill. Using cunning and terrain advantage, Spartacus's forces reportedly surrounded and defeated the legion, securing weapons, food, and morale-boosting supplies. This victory was more than a tactical success. It solidified Spartacus's reputation as a leader who could challenge Rome itself. Recruits poured in, swelling the ranks to tens of thousands, transforming what had been a small escape into a full-scale insurrection. The social dynamics of the rebel army also began to take shape during these early battles. While many were motivated purely by the desire for freedom, others were inspired by the charismatic leadership of Spartacus. His ability to organize diverse groups of people, men and women from different backgrounds, languages, and cultures, into a unified force speaks to his extraordinary skill as a commander. It is said that he maintained strict discipline, treating his soldiers with respect and fairness, which contrasted sharply with the brutal treatment many of them had suffered under their Roman masters. The early battles also exposed the vulnerability of Roman society. For all its military might, Rome had underestimated the power of collective will among the oppressed. Spartacus's uprising highlighted that even a seemingly unassailable empire could be challenged by ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination. The Roman response, initially fragmented and reactive, would eventually grow more aggressive, but in these first encounters, the rebels were the masters of strategy, dictating when, where, and how engagements occurred. Spartacus's victories also carried symbolic weight. Each battle represented more than a tactical win. It was a statement that freedom was possible, that the institution of slavery, which underpinned Rome's economy and society, was not invincible. This psychological impact cannot be overstated. The fear instilled in Roman commanders and the hope kindled among the oppressed alike contributed to the momentum of the rebellion, allowing it to grow in ways that a purely military analysis might not fully capture. By the end of this early phase, Spartacus had not only survived, but thrived against incredible odds. From a group of escaped gladiators, he forged an army capable of defeating Roman forces in multiple engagements, employing strategies that would later be studied as examples of unconventional warfare. These early battles set the stage for the rebellion's most audacious moments, demonstrating that under the right leadership, even the mightiest empire could be challenged. In reflecting on these first victories, one sees the blend of courage, intellect, and sheer human will that defined Spartacus. His story reminds us that rebellion is never just about brute force. It is about vision, organization, and the ability to inspire others to act against overwhelming odds. In these early encounters, Spartacus's rebellion was not merely a threat to Rome's legions. It was a challenge to the very notion of control, authority, and the power of the oppressed to demand freedom. Section 3. Expansion of the revolt and strategic dilemmas. As Spartacus's rebellion gained momentum, the challenges of leadership expanded alongside his growing army. From a force of a few hundred escaped gladiators, the insurgents quickly ballooned to tens of thousands, drawing enslaved laborers, runaway prisoners, and disaffected peasants from across southern Italy. While this expansion brought greater power, it also introduced a complex web of strategic, logistical, and political dilemmas that would test Spartacus's ingenuity and resolve at every turn. The very success of the early rebellion created new pressures. With such a vast and diverse force, Spartacus faced the daunting task of maintaining cohesion. His army now included people from a wide variety of social and ethnic backgrounds, many of whom had different motivations and expectations. While some were driven by an unyielding desire for freedom, others sought revenge, plunder, or simply survival. Balancing these competing priorities required a delicate mix of discipline and diplomacy. Spartacus reportedly established strict rules to maintain order, ensuring that resources were shared fairly and that acts of violence against non-combatants were limited. Although maintaining these standards in the chaos of rebellion was a constant struggle. The geographic expansion of the revolt introduced further complications. The rebels now controlled large swaths of southern Italy, moving across hills, plains, and river valleys. This increased territorial control offered strategic advantages, including access to resources, hiding places, and the ability to evade Roman forces. However, it also made the army harder to supply. Feeding tens of thousands of men required careful planning and coordination, and raids on towns and estates became a necessity not only for survival, but also for maintaining morale. Each engagement carried the dual purpose of acquiring food and supplies, while also reinforcing the rebels' reputation as a formidable force that could defy Rome itself. As the rebellion grew, so too did the attention it received from Roman authorities. Initially, Roman commanders had underestimated the threat, treating the insurgents as a minor disturbance. But as reports of victories, territorial control, and increasing army size reached the Senate, a more serious response became inevitable. The first Roman attempts to crush the rebellion were poorly coordinated, underestimating both the rebels' tactical skill and their willingness to fight fiercely for their freedom. Spartacus capitalized on these errors, leading his forces to decisive victories that further expanded the uprising. These encounters demonstrated not only the tactical brilliance of Spartacus, but also the limits of Rome's command when facing unconventional warfare. The expansion of the revolt also prompted difficult strategic decisions. Spartacus faced a choice: continue his guerrilla-style campaigns in the south, consolidating power and refining his army's discipline, or march north toward the Alps, potentially leading his followers to safety beyond Roman control. Each option carried risks. Remaining in southern Italy risked encirclement by the growing Roman response. Moving north offered escape, but left the rebellion vulnerable to supply shortages and harsh terrain. Ancient sources suggest that Spartacus struggled with these dilemmas, weighing the immediate needs of his army against the long-term goal of freedom for all. In addition to logistical concerns, the expansion brought new moral and ethical challenges. With such a large and diverse army, Spartacus had to navigate internal tensions. Some followers pressed for vengeance against Roman towns, while others sought more restrained conduct. Maintaining unity and discipline required constant negotiation and the ability to inspire loyalty through example. Spartacus's leadership style, characterized by fairness, empathy, and charisma, helped to hold the army together. But it was an ongoing challenge that demanded vigilance and flexibility. The strategic dilemmas were compounded by the Roman response, which became increasingly sophisticated. Consular armies, led by experienced generals, began to converge on the rebels' positions, attempting to cut off their movements and resources. This forced Spartacus to continually adapt his tactics, moving rapidly, using natural terrain features for defense, and employing deception to mislead pursuing forces. In these engagements, the rebels relied on mobility, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the local landscape, contrasting sharply with the slow, methodical approach of Roman legions. These tactics allowed the rebels to maintain their freedom and even achieve victories against better equipped and better trained soldiers. The expansion also revealed the rebels' influence beyond mere military might. The very existence of Spartacus's army inspired fear among Roman citizens and confidence among enslaved populations. His ability to lead and organize such a force challenged the social hierarchy, demonstrating that even a society as structured as Rome could be threatened by collective will. The psychological impact of this rebellion extended far beyond the battlefield, shaking the confidence of Rome's elite and emboldening others who sought to resist oppression. Among the most significant consequences of this expansion was the increasing political dimension of the rebellion. Spartacus now faced the question of objectives. Was the goal simply survival, or did the rebellion aspire to a more ambitious vision, such as toppling the Roman order or escaping to freedom beyond the Alps? These questions were not merely theoretical. They influenced decisions on whether to attack Roman cities, negotiate with external allies, or concentrate on preserving the army's cohesion. Spartacus's choices during this period reveal a leader balancing tactical pragmatism with visionary ambition, seeking both immediate survival and the broader dream of liberation. The challenges of expansion also tested Spartacus's capacity for delegation and the empowerment of subordinate leaders. With an army spread across large territories, it became impossible for one man to oversee every movement. Spartacus appointed trusted lieutenants to command smaller units, delegating authority while maintaining overall strategic coherence. This network of leadership allowed the rebels to respond quickly to changing circumstances, conduct coordinated raids, and protect their growing numbers from encirclement or ambush. Such organizational sophistication was unusual for a rebellion of its scale and contributed significantly to its initial successes. By the end of this phase, Spartacus had transformed from a gladiator seeking personal survival into the leader of a complex, dynamic and highly motivated army capable of challenging Rome itself. The expansion of the revolt demonstrated not only the effectiveness of his military tactics, but also his extraordinary skill in leadership, diplomacy, and strategy. Yet the growing size of the army, the diversity of its members, and the increasing attention of Roman forces meant that each new day brought fresh challenges. The rebellion's success had become both its greatest strength and its most perilous risk. The early victories and rapid expansion of Spartacus's forces set the stage for some of the most dramatic moments in Roman history. It was a time of both exhilaration and danger, where brilliant tactics, human courage, and the longing for freedom combined to create a force capable of shaking the foundations of one of the ancient world's most powerful empires. In this period, the rebellion evolved from a desperate escape into a highly organized, strategically aware movement, demonstrating the transformative power of leadership, vision, and the relentless pursuit of liberty. Section 4. Pivotal encounters with Roman generals and political implications. As Spartacus's rebellion surged across southern Italy, it inevitably drew the focused attention of Rome's military and political machinery. The rapid growth of the insurgent army, combined with its audacious raids and victories, sent shockwaves through the Senate, forcing Rome to reconsider its earlier underestimation of the revolt. The encounters between Spartacus's forces and Roman generals during this phase of the uprising were not only battles of strategy and strength, but also moments that carried deep political significance, reflecting the fragility of Roman authority in the face of an extraordinary insurrection. Initially, the Roman response was fragmented. Consuls and local governors underestimated the speed, discipline, and tactical acumen of Spartacus's army, assuming that a force composed largely of escaped gladiators and enslaved peasants could not pose a lasting threat. Early skirmishes, however, revealed the rebels' extraordinary adaptability. The insurgents used the terrain to their advantage, selecting battlegrounds that favored mobility over heavy infantry, exploiting the Roman reliance on rigid formations. Rivers, hills, and narrow passes became natural allies, allowing Spartacus to offset numerical disadvantages when facing professional Roman legions. The first truly significant engagement occurred when Roman forces, dispatched under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber, attempted to besiege the rebels on Mount Vesuvius. Glaber, relying on traditional siege tactics and assuming that starvation and entrapment would force submission, failed to anticipate the cunning and resourcefulness of Spartacus. In a remarkable display of ingenuity, Spartacus and his followers constructed makeshift ropes and ladders from vines and debris, scaling the cliffs under cover of darkness and launching a surprise attack on the Roman camp. The Romans, caught off guard, suffered a devastating defeat. This encounter not only marked a tactical triumph for the insurgents, but also highlighted a growing psychological dimension. The aura of invincibility surrounding Spartacus's army began to erode the confidence of Rome's commanders. Following these victories, the Senate escalated its response, sending experienced consular armies to quell the uprising. Leaders such as Publius Varinius and Lucius Furius attempted to intercept and destroy the rebels, coordinating multiple columns in an effort to trap them. Yet Spartacus's forces displayed remarkable strategic flexibility. They avoided prolonged engagements that could lead to encirclement, utilized rapid marches to outflank opponents, and exploited intelligence gathered from sympathetic local populations. These encounters emphasized the rebels' understanding of asymmetrical warfare, an approach that confounded traditional Roman military doctrine and elevated Spartacus from a local insurgent to a figure capable of challenging Rome's hegemony. The political implications of these engagements were profound. In Rome, news of the defeats stirred anxiety and debate among senators and magistrates. The idea that a slave-led army could repeatedly defeat trained legions shook the foundations of Roman pride and authority. Decisions regarding troop allocations, consular assignments, and even the deployment of auxiliaries became highly politicized, reflecting the Senate's growing concern that failure to suppress Spartacus could encourage further unrest among the empire's vast enslaved population. The rebellion was no longer merely a military problem. It had become a political crisis with far-reaching social consequences. Spartacus, fully aware of the political ramifications, skillfully leveraged victories for morale and recruitment. Word of each triumph spread quickly, inspiring both awe and fear. Enslaved populations across Italy viewed the rebellion as a beacon of hope, swelling the ranks of the insurgents, with men and women eager to seize their own freedom. These recruitment waves, however, added complexity to leadership, as Spartacus now had to integrate a more diverse and larger force while maintaining discipline and focus. The political dimension was also evident in his careful treatment of local towns. While some raids were necessary to secure supplies, indiscriminate violence risked alienating potential supporters, forcing Spartacus to balance military necessity with the optics of legitimacy and restraint. Strategically, Spartacus faced a persistent tension between offensive operations and long-term objectives. Roman generals, despite occasional missteps, gradually refined their tactics, seeking to corner and starve the rebels. The insurgent army had to continuously adapt, sometimes feigning retreats, other times conducting rapid strikes against isolated units. This dynamic created a series of high-stakes encounters where tactical brilliance could yield immediate gains, yet overextension risked catastrophic losses. Each engagement demanded careful judgment, and Spartacus's ability to inspire trust and unity among his followers was as crucial as his command of battlefield maneuvers. The most politically resonant encounters came as Spartacus' army threatened to move toward Rome itself. While historians debate whether he intended to march on the capital, the very possibility forced senators to confront the vulnerability of their city. Emergency measures were considered, including reinforcing city defenses, recalling legions from distant provinces, and even negotiating with allies to secure reinforcements. The psychological impact of a potentially slave-led threat so close to Rome intensified internal political tensions, underscoring the rebellion's symbolic as well as military significance. Amid these high-stakes encounters, the character of Spartacus as a leader became increasingly evident. Ancient sources suggest that he was not merely a military tactician, but also a shrewd political actor, aware of the symbolic power of his actions. His victories challenged the social order, revealing vulnerabilities in a society that relied heavily on slavery and hierarchical control. Each triumph against Roman forces served as both a morale boost for the insurgents and a cautionary signal to the broader population, illustrating that even the most entrenched institutions could be unsettled by courage, strategy, and collective will. The encounters with Roman generals also revealed the limitations of both sides. Spartacus's forces, despite their skill and motivation, lacked the logistical support, heavy weaponry, and organized supply lines of Rome. Conversely, Roman commanders struggled to anticipate the insurgents' unconventional tactics, often underestimating their ingenuity and the cohesion Spartacus could inspire. The result was a series of engagements that highlighted the evolving nature of warfare, where traditional military supremacy could be challenged by unconventional forces operating with vision, flexibility, and a deep understanding of human motivation. By the end of this period, Spartacus's rebellion had transformed from a localized escape into a national phenomenon, one that combined tactical innovation with profound social and political resonance. The encounters with Roman generals were not merely battles of strength. They were confrontations that questioned the very fabric of Roman society, forcing an empire to reckon with both its military vulnerabilities and the aspirations of those it had subjugated. Spartacus's leadership, tactical acumen, and moral authority positioned him as one of the most remarkable figures in ancient history, capable of converting desperation into strategic mastery and insurgency into a movement that temporarily shook the world's most powerful empire. Section 5. Internal Dynamics, Leadership Challenges, and Strategic Victories. As Spartacus's rebellion matured, the insurgent army evolved from a loosely organized group of escaped gladiators and slaves into a sophisticated force with its own internal hierarchies, strategies, and leadership structures. This period marked a critical phase in the uprising, where the cohesion of the army and Spartacus' ability to maintain authority and morale became as decisive as his skill on the battlefield. Understanding the internal dynamics of this rapidly expanding force provides a window into both the remarkable successes and the eventual limitations of the revolt, highlighting how a movement born out of desperation required not only courage, but also complex organization, negotiation, and strategic vision. Initially, the army's composition posed unique challenges. It was a melting pot of individuals from diverse backgrounds. Gladiators trained for entertainment rather than conventional warfare. Enslaved farmers, accustomed to labor rather than combat. And some opportunistic outlaws seeking freedom and plunder. These differences created both strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, the gladiators' rigorous training provided unmatched fighting skill and discipline in small-scale combat. On the other hand, integrating untrained peasants and runaway slaves demanded inventive approaches to organization, training, and motivation. Spartacus needed to instill a sense of purpose that transcended personal grievances, creating unity around a shared vision of freedom and survival. Leadership within the army was another nuanced challenge. While Spartacus was universally recognized as the primary commander, historical accounts suggest that he delegated responsibilities to trusted lieutenants who oversaw specific divisions or regions. Each leader had to balance their own authority with respect for Spartacus's overarching command, ensuring decisions were executed effectively without undermining the cohesion of the larger force. This system of decentralized leadership allowed the army to operate with flexibility, responding quickly to Roman maneuvers, but it also required constant communication and mutual trust, elements that could be strained under pressure or in the aftermath of heavy engagements. Morale was equally vital. Unlike conventional Roman legions, whose soldiers were motivated by pay, discipline, and duty, Spartacus's followers were united by the promise of liberation. This intrinsic motivation could produce extraordinary bravery and creativity in battle, yet it was also fragile, susceptible to fear, hunger, and fatigue. Spartacus understood the psychological dimension of leadership, often taking personal risks alongside his men, demonstrating that he shared their hardships and understood their fears. Such actions reinforced loyalty and inspired followers to undertake operations that might have seemed impossible, such as ambushing well-entrenched Roman units or executing daring night raids. The internal dynamics also included mechanisms for discipline. While detailed records are scarce, ancient sources hint that Spartacus maintained strict rules against desertion, insubordination, and unnecessary cruelty toward allies or neutral populations. Maintaining discipline was critical not only to military effectiveness, but also to the movement's broader reputation. Reckless or undisciplined behavior could alienate potential supporters, weaken cohesion, and invite harsher Roman retaliation. Spartacus had to strike a delicate balance, enforcing order while preserving the morale and freedom that were the army's central motivations. Strategically, this period saw some of the rebellion's most remarkable victories. After evading initial Roman consular armies, Spartacus's forces conducted a series of offensives that demonstrated both tactical brilliance and an understanding of larger operational strategy. In particular, his army executed coordinated strikes against multiple Roman detachments, exploiting gaps in communication and mobility. Ancient sources describe encounters where smaller rebel contingents lured Roman forces into traps or ambushes, allowing Spartacus to concentrate his main force on decisive points. These victories showcased not just battlefield skill, but also intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and strategic foresight, qualities that elevated Spartacus from rebel leader to military tactician. The internal culture of the army also reflected a blend of pragmatism and aspiration. Survivors were not simply expected to fight. They were encouraged to contribute to logistical planning, forage for supplies, and participate in decisions about routes and operations. Some accounts suggest councils or discussions where the most experienced gladiators or strategic thinkers could offer input, fostering a participatory culture that strengthened commitment and innovation. This approach helped integrate new recruits, particularly those drawn from the surrounding countryside, turning a heterogeneous group into a more cohesive and effective fighting force. Despite these strengths, challenges persisted. As the army grew, the practical difficulties of supplying thousands of people and animals became acute. Foraging missions, while necessary, risked alienating local populations. Additionally, differing ambitions among leaders sometimes created friction. Some historical interpretations suggest that Spartacus faced internal debates over whether to march north toward freedom beyond the Alps or remain in southern Italy to sustain the rebellion. These disagreements highlighted the tension between immediate survival, tactical advantage, and long-term strategic goals, forcing Spartacus to navigate not only military threats, but also internal politics and the expectations of thousands of followers. One of the most impressive aspects of Spartacus's leadership during this period was his ability to maintain cohesion while achieving strategic victories. He consistently avoided being cornered by superior Roman forces, demonstrated an understanding of both conventional and guerrilla-style tactics, and exploited psychological warfare by creating the impression of invincibility. Each victory reinforced morale, attracted new recruits, and heightened the political alarm in Rome, amplifying the symbolic power of the rebellion beyond its immediate tactical impact. Yet even at its peak, the army faced inherent limitations. Unlike the professional Roman legions, Spartacus's forces lacked formal supply chains, heavy siege equipment, and consistent reinforcements. Maintaining cohesion required constant attention, and each engagement carried the risk of catastrophic loss. The internal dynamics that had allowed for extraordinary adaptability also introduced fragility. Without Spartacus's unifying presence, disputes among leaders or disillusionment among rank and file could have fragmented the army. Ultimately, the internal dynamics, leadership challenges, and strategic victories of this period illustrate the extraordinary nature of Spartacus's rebellion. It was not merely a revolt of slaves. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign that combined military genius, political acumen, and a deep understanding of human motivation. The army's successes were as much a product of discipline, cohesion, and morale as they were of courage and skill, highlighting the interplay between organizational ingenuity and battlefield strategy. Section 6. Bold maneuvers and escalating clashes with Rome. As the rebellion led by Spartacus expanded across the Italian peninsula, the nature of the conflict transformed dramatically. What had begun as a relatively small-scale uprising of escaped gladiators soon became a major military challenge for the Roman Republic. Spartacus's ability to execute bold maneuvers, often against overwhelming odds, underscored not only his personal bravery, but also a sophisticated understanding of battlefield strategy. These maneuvers reveal how a numerically inferior, irregular force could repeatedly frustrate the most formidable military machine of the ancient world, relying on mobility, surprise, and ingenuity rather than sheer strength. One of the defining features of this phase of the rebellion was Spartacus's use of movement and terrain. Unlike the Roman legions, which relied on rigid formations and supply lines, Spartacus and his army were highly mobile. They traversed mountains, forests, and river valleys with remarkable speed, often appearing where Roman commanders least expected them. Ancient accounts suggest that Spartacus exploited the natural landscape for defensive advantage, positioning his forces in locations that maximized the impact of ambushes and limited the effectiveness of the Roman heavy infantry. Hills, narrow passes, and wooded areas became tools in his hands, compensating for the army's lack of formal siege weapons or armored cavalry. This strategic use of terrain allowed Spartacus to dictate the terms of many engagements, forcing the Romans to react rather than act, a position that historically favored disciplined, flexible insurgent forces. Surprise was another critical component of Spartacus's strategy. The Roman response was often slow, weighed down by bureaucracy, local politics, and underestimation of the rebellion's scale. Spartacus leveraged these delays to conduct rapid raids, capturing supplies, freeing other slaves, and sometimes devastating Roman garrisons before reinforcements could arrive. This pattern of hit-and-run tactics created an aura of unpredictability around the rebel army. Roman commanders reported frustration at encountering what appeared to be larger forces than actually existed, a psychological edge that Spartacus nurtured carefully. By alternating between sudden assaults and strategic withdrawals, he kept his forces alive and forced the Romans into costly, poorly coordinated campaigns. The audacity of Spartacus's maneuvers often extended beyond tactical innovation into psychological warfare. For instance, he sometimes allowed rumors of imminent attacks to spread, causing panic in towns and Roman outposts, even when no immediate threat was present. These methods were not simply opportunistic. They demonstrated a keen understanding of human perception and morale. Spartacus recognized that fear and uncertainty could be as powerful as swords, and he applied this knowledge consistently to compensate for material disadvantages. The growing reputation of invincibility drew new followers, including other slaves, disaffected peasants, and even mercenaries, swelling the ranks of his army at crucial moments. Clashes with Roman forces became increasingly intense as the rebellion grew. Consular armies, sent to suppress the insurgents, often met with unexpected setbacks. Ancient sources describe battles in which Spartacus's forces, though sometimes outnumbered, used mobility, feints, and carefully orchestrated attacks to defeat or escape Roman encirclement. In some accounts, the rebels executed maneuvers that split Roman formations, encircled detachments, or lured enemy troops into ambushes. These victories were not the result of luck alone. They reflected disciplined coordination among Spartacus's lieutenants and an ability to anticipate Roman tactics. The insurgent army adapted quickly, learning from each encounter and refining methods for both attack and evasion, demonstrating organizational maturity uncommon for a force of its type. However, these successes were accompanied by significant challenges. Sustaining a mobile army of tens of thousands required immense resources. Spartacus's forces were heavily reliant on local foraging and the seizure of Roman supplies, a strategy that risked provoking hostile responses from civilian populations. Additionally, internal disagreements occasionally threatened cohesion. Some lieutenants favored aggressive northward movements toward freedom beyond the Alps, while others advocated remaining in southern Italy to consolidate control and plunder resources. Spartacus had to mediate these debates carefully, balancing short-term tactical needs with long-term strategic objectives. Maintaining unity among a diverse and rapidly growing army required not only authority, but also empathy, persuasion, and personal example. The bold maneuvers of Spartacus also highlight his capacity for strategic deception. In several key instances, historical accounts suggest that he deliberately misled Roman commanders regarding his intentions. Troop movements were timed to suggest one target, only for the army to strike another. Apparent retreats were used to lure enemy forces into disadvantageous positions. These tactics reflected both a tactical intuition and an understanding of the broader operational context of Roman military command. Spartacus effectively transformed his army into a force that could not be easily anticipated or contained, a revolutionary approach for a rebellion primarily composed of non-professional soldiers. Despite repeated tactical brilliance, the encounters with Rome revealed systemic vulnerabilities. Roman forces were able to regroup, reinforce, and apply overwhelming pressure through sheer numbers and logistical organization. Each battle carried the risk of catastrophic loss, as the rebel army lacked fortifications and permanent supply depots. Moreover, while Spartacus's strategic vision was remarkable, sustaining morale over prolonged campaigns was difficult. Fatigue, hunger, and the constant threat of betrayal or desertion tested the bonds of loyalty, demanding extraordinary leadership skills to prevent fragmentation. Nevertheless, the period of bold maneuvers and escalating clashes solidified Spartacus's legacy. His ability to outmaneuver, outthink, and outfight Rome repeatedly created a level of disruption that alarmed senators, consuls, and generals alike. Reports of his successes spread rapidly, inspiring both fear and admiration, and cementing his status as a figure capable of extraordinary military innovation. The rebellion demonstrated that an army composed of determined insurgents, led by a tactically astute commander, could challenge the most powerful military force of its era, at least temporarily. In conclusion, Spartacus's maneuvers and clashes during this phase of the rebellion showcase the interplay between bold strategy, disciplined leadership, and innovative tactics. Through mobility, surprise, psychological insight, and organizational acumen, Spartacus consistently kept Roman forces off balance, extended the reach of his rebellion, and maintained cohesion within a diverse and rapidly expanding army. These campaigns not only illustrate the practical methods by which he defied Rome, but also highlight the remarkable human qualities, courage, ingenuity, and foresight that sustained the rebellion against overwhelming odds. His tactical brilliance, coupled with the loyalty and determination of his followers, transformed a slave uprising into a historical force capable of shaking the foundations of the Roman Republic. Section 7. The Roman counteroffensive and strategic pressures. As Spartacus's rebellion swelled in size and notoriety, the Roman Senate could no longer treat it as a minor disturbance or a simple matter of escaped slaves. The early failures of smaller legions to contain the insurgents underscored the seriousness of the threat. By this stage, the rebellion had grown into a full-scale military crisis, prompting Rome to launch a carefully orchestrated counteroffensive. This period of the conflict highlights the contrast between Spartacus's innovative guerrilla tactics and the methodical, hierarchical approach of the Roman military machine. The Roman response began with a series of consular armies, each composed of experienced legions under the command of elected generals. Unlike the flexible, mobile insurgents, these legions relied on structure, discipline, and sheer firepower. The Senate recognized that defeating Spartacus required not only tactical skill, but also strategic patience, coordination, and overwhelming force. Every legion was meticulously provisioned, formations were drilled, and intelligence about rebel movements became a priority. In essence, the Romans were attempting to impose order on a situation defined by chaos and unpredictability. One of the primary strategies employed by the Romans was to restrict the movement of Spartacus's forces and cut off their access to supplies. Recognizing that the rebel army relied heavily on looted provisions and foraged food, Roman generals established fortified camps and supply depots along key routes. These encampments were designed not merely for defense, but to serve as logistical anchors, preventing Spartacus from using rapid, unpredictable marches to gather resources. By controlling access to critical rivers, roads, and towns, the Romans sought to gradually force the rebels into a position of attrition where numbers and discipline could decisively prevail. The counteroffensive also involved extensive intelligence and reconnaissance efforts. Roman commanders deployed scouts, informants, and local allies to monitor the movements of the rebel army. They relied on knowledge of terrain, seasonal weather patterns, and even local civilian sentiment to anticipate potential maneuvers. In some instances, the Romans attempted to exploit weaknesses within the rebel ranks, including tensions among Spartacus's lieutenants or discontent among newly recruited contingents. This multi-layered approach demonstrated Rome's methodical, almost bureaucratic style of warfare, which emphasized foresight, planning, and adaptability. Despite the strength of the Roman counteroffensive, Spartacus remained a formidable opponent. His prior experience with ambushes, rapid maneuvers, and psychological tactics allowed him to evade encirclement on several occasions. Where Roman generals expected rigid adherence to predictable lines of advance, Spartacus employed deception, feints, and diversions. He often divided his forces, creating smaller, agile units capable of striking isolated Roman detachments, then reconsolidating to maintain overall cohesion. These actions frustrated Roman commanders and prolonged the rebellion, demonstrating how a well-led insurgent force could counterbalance the advantages of a conventional military apparatus. The strategic pressures on both sides became increasingly acute as the campaign progressed. For the Romans, failure to suppress the rebellion threatened not only political credibility, but also the stability of regions critical to the Republic. Senators demanded decisive victories, while consuls faced scrutiny over both personal honor and public expectation. Every delay or setback had political consequences, compelling Roman generals to adopt increasingly aggressive measures. Conversely, Spartacus confronted the challenge of sustaining morale, cohesion, and supply lines within a growing army. Each engagement required careful judgment. Too bold, and he risked catastrophic losses. Too cautious, and the momentum of the rebellion could falter under Roman pressure. One notable aspect of the Roman counteroffensive was its emphasis on engineering and fortifications. The legions frequently constructed extensive earthworks, fortified camps, and temporary barriers designed to channel or trap the rebel army. These constructions were intended to limit Spartacus's options and provide secure staging grounds for attacks. In some battles, Romans attempted to employ coordinated pincer movements, forcing the rebels into narrow corridors or between two advancing forces. Such strategies highlighted the Romans' preference for attrition and encirclement, contrasting with the mobility-focused tactics of the insurgents. Political pressure from Rome also played a role in shaping the conduct of the counteroffensive. The Senate demanded swift resolution, often replacing generals who were slow to act or appeared indecisive. This created tension among Roman commanders, who had to balance careful planning with the expectations of both their peers and superiors. Spartacus, aware of these pressures, sometimes used them to his advantage, launching attacks when Roman generals were constrained by political considerations or when coordination among consular forces was incomplete. This interplay between politics and military strategy added a complex layer to the ongoing conflict, emphasizing that warfare in this era was rarely confined to the battlefield alone. Despite the mounting pressures, the counteroffensive gradually began to limit the strategic freedom of Spartacus's forces. Roman legions became increasingly adept at anticipating movements, intercepting raiding parties, and securing key geographic choke points. The insurgent army, while still formidable, could no longer act entirely at will. Opportunities for sudden decisive strikes became scarcer. Each encounter with disciplined Roman forces now carried higher stakes, underscoring the inherent vulnerability of a rebel army, lacking permanent fortifications and a reliable supply infrastructure. The escalating Roman counteroffensive also exposed broader questions about the nature of rebellion and power in the ancient world. Spartacus's campaign was remarkable not only for its military success, but also for the existential threat it posed to the social and political order of Rome. The insurgency challenged assumptions about the loyalty of enslaved populations, the limitations of conventional military power, and the vulnerability of even the mightiest republic to organized, determined resistance. Each engagement reflected not merely tactical skill, but a profound confrontation between two very different forms of authority. One rooted in discipline, hierarchy, and institutional power. The other in improvisation, morale, and charismatic leadership. In summary, the Roman counteroffensive marked a critical turning point in the rebellion of Spartacus. The careful planning, logistical organization, and strategic patience of the Republic began to exert increasing pressure on the insurgent forces, testing their endurance and adaptability. Spartacus's continued successes during this phase illustrate both the resilience of his leadership and the remarkable ability of a motivated, unconventional army to challenge even the most powerful military establishment of its era. The interplay between Roman strategic pressure and rebel ingenuity highlights the complexity of this historical episode, revealing that the struggle was as much a battle of wits, morale, and organizational skill as it was one of arms. Section 8. Spartacus's daring plans for escape and freedom. As the Roman counteroffensive intensified, Spartacus and his followers were faced with a growing dilemma: how to preserve the rebellion while simultaneously securing freedom for the enslaved men who had rallied to his cause. The early phases of the insurgency had been marked by rapid, opportunistic raids and temporary victories, but sustaining such momentum against the increasingly organized legions required long-term strategic planning. Spartacus understood that the success of his army depended not only on defeating Roman forces in battle, but also on creating a pathway to lasting freedom beyond the borders of Italy. This dual challenge of military survival and strategic escape shaped many of the boldest decisions he would make during the campaign. The idea of retreating toward the Alps, a mountainous region in northern Italy, emerged as a pivotal objective for Spartacus and his commanders. The Alps represented more than a physical barrier. They symbolized potential liberation. By reaching these remote highlands, the rebels could seek refuge, evade Roman pursuit, and possibly disperse to their homelands, many of which lay beyond the Republic's immediate control. However, this plan was fraught with difficulty. The terrain itself was treacherous, particularly for an army comprising thousands of men, women, and children, many of whom were inexperienced in navigating mountains under harsh conditions. Furthermore, the journey required careful coordination to avoid ambushes by pursuing Roman forces who were actively attempting to block escape routes and intersect any attempts to flee northward. To achieve this ambitious goal, Spartacus relied on both meticulous planning and improvisational tactics. He divided his forces into mobile contingents capable of rapid movement, employing scouts to identify safe routes and potential threats. Some groups were tasked with engaging Roman detachments to distract and mislead them, while others focused on securing food and supplies along the way. This division of labor, combined with the morale-boosting effect of small but decisive victories, allowed the rebel army to maintain cohesion and confidence, despite the mounting pressure of the Roman counteroffensive. Spartacus's approach demonstrates a remarkable understanding of asymmetric warfare, where flexibility and strategic unpredictability could offset the numerical and logistical advantages of a conventional army. In addition to the strategic focus on escape, Spartacus also worked to instill a sense of purpose and unity among his followers. Leadership in the midst of constant danger required more than tactical acumen. It demanded charisma, trust, and the ability to inspire loyalty. Spartacus addressed these needs by emphasizing the broader vision of freedom from slavery and the reclamation of dignity for every individual in the ranks. Through speeches, rituals, and demonstrations of personal bravery, he reinforced the idea that each participant was not merely a soldier, but an active agent in a movement that could challenge the very foundations of Roman authority. This combination of ideological motivation and practical leadership was essential in sustaining the rebellion during periods of scarcity, fatigue, and high risk. One of the most daring aspects of Spartacus's plans was the use of deception to mask the army's intended path. Roman generals were skilled at predicting movements, and any predictable course would likely have resulted in encirclement or annihilation. Spartacus, therefore, employed feints, false marches, and diversions to mislead the Roman forces. At times, he moved part of his army toward one region to suggest an attempt at a southern escape, only to reverse course toward the north once the Romans had committed their forces elsewhere. These maneuvers required precise timing, effective communication, and unwavering discipline from the troops, highlighting both the strategic genius of Spartacus and the remarkable adaptability of his followers. Beyond the military maneuvers, Spartacus also had to contend with logistical and environmental challenges. Feeding a large army on the move, particularly one composed of former slaves with limited resources, was an ongoing struggle. The rebels relied on raiding nearby settlements, hunting, and foraging, which brought them into both tactical engagements and moral dilemmas. Sparing civilians when possible helped maintain local support and prevent additional enemies from arising. But scarcity often forced difficult choices. Weather and terrain added further complexity. Rivers, mountains, and winter conditions could slow progress or create vulnerabilities that Roman forces were quick to exploit. In the midst of these challenges, Spartacus's leadership was defined by the ability to adapt, prioritize, and inspire confidence even under the most daunting circumstances. The psychological component of Spartacus's escape strategy was equally critical. Maintaining morale was essential, particularly when faced with the knowledge that Roman legions were closing in from multiple directions. Spartacus fostered a culture of resilience and solidarity, encouraging his followers to view each obstacle as a test of collective strength. This emphasis on unity allowed the army to continue functioning effectively despite fatigue, loss, and the constant threat of betrayal or desertion. The ability to inspire such cohesion in an army, largely composed of recently liberated slaves, underscores the exceptional qualities of Spartacus as both a military and symbolic leader. As the army approached the northern territories, Spartacus's plans increasingly focused on the ultimate objective: crossing into regions beyond Roman control, where the possibility of freedom became tangible. Reaching the Alps remained central to this vision, as it would allow the rebels to scatter strategically while minimizing the risk of total destruction. Every march, skirmish, and encampment along the route was undertaken with this larger goal in mind, blending tactical necessity with visionary leadership. Spartacus's capacity to think several moves ahead, anticipate Roman responses, and adapt dynamically ensured that his rebellion remained a persistent threat despite the overwhelming resources of the Republic. In retrospect, Spartacus's plans for escape and freedom reveal a sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and human motivation. They illustrate how a combination of bold vision, tactical ingenuity, and psychological insight can enable a relatively small force to challenge an empire. While the ultimate outcome of the rebellion would see Roman forces eventually regain control, the daring maneuvers toward potential liberation underscore the extraordinary resilience and creativity of the insurgent army. Spartacus's campaign is remembered not only for its battlefield exploits, but also for its audacious attempt to transform oppression into self-determined freedom. Section 9. Internal challenges and leadership decisions. While Spartacus's military genius and strategic vision drove his rebellion forward, he faced another formidable challenge that was less visible than the Roman legions, but just as critical: maintaining cohesion and loyalty within his diverse and growing army. The insurgent force was composed of thousands of escaped slaves and disillusioned peasants, each carrying their own fears, desires, and personal ambitions. This eclectic mix of backgrounds, experiences, and temperaments created both strength and vulnerability. Spartacus understood that leadership in this context required more than tactical brilliance. It demanded diplomacy, psychological insight, and constant vigilance. One of the primary internal challenges was managing differing priorities among the followers. Some rebels were driven by the immediate goal of survival, seeking only temporary refuge from Roman authority. Others were motivated by a more radical vision of permanent freedom, or even revenge against their former oppressors. Balancing these divergent motivations required Spartacus to craft a unifying narrative that could inspire commitment while mitigating potential conflicts. By emphasizing shared values such as liberty, solidarity, and the right to self-determination, he fostered a sense of collective purpose that transcended individual grievances. This ideological cohesion was essential in sustaining the army during long marches, intense battles, and periods of scarcity. The question of discipline posed another significant challenge. An army of liberated slaves was not inherently structured like the professional legions of Rome. Spartacus faced the delicate task of imposing rules without creating resentment. Leaders within the rebellion were appointed based on merit, bravery, and trustworthiness rather than social rank, which helped cultivate respect and a sense of fairness. Military organization relied on smaller units led by capable commanders who could enforce order and coordinate maneuvers, while Spartacus maintained overall strategic control. This balance between centralized leadership and decentralized autonomy allowed the army to remain agile and responsive while minimizing internal disorder. Conflict management also became a recurring necessity. Disputes arose over spoils from raids, distribution of food, and decisions about whether to engage Roman forces or continue retreating. Spartacus approached these situations with both pragmatism and a commitment to fairness, often mediating disputes personally and establishing guidelines that would prevent favoritism or arbitrary judgment. This approach strengthened loyalty by demonstrating that leadership was accountable and that the army functioned according to shared rules rather than individual whims. In many ways, these internal governance practices mirrored early forms of participatory leadership, where consensus building and ethical consideration were as important as strategic acumen. The presence of women and children within the rebel camp added further complexity. These non-combatants required protection, food, and shelter, creating logistical burdens that could influence strategic decisions. Spartacus and his lieutenants had to allocate resources carefully, determine the pace of marches, and sometimes make difficult choices about engagement with enemy forces to avoid unnecessary exposure. Protecting families reinforced morale and fostered a sense of purpose beyond the immediate thrill of rebellion. It reminded the fighters that their struggle was not solely about defiance, but about creating a sustainable future for those they cared for. Another dimension of internal challenge was the need to inspire confidence in the face of Roman propaganda and psychological warfare. The Republic sought to sow distrust, offering rewards for defection and spreading rumors about the inevitability of Roman victory. Spartacus countered these efforts by cultivating trust and transparency within his ranks. He communicated openly about plans, risks, and potential outcomes, ensuring that followers felt informed rather than manipulated. This openness helped maintain cohesion and discourage desertion, which could have been disastrous given the army's reliance on numbers and morale. Leadership decisions also extended to strategic alliances with other groups. Spartacus occasionally encountered communities of disaffected farmers, bandits, or other marginalized populations who could offer support or reinforcements. Deciding when to integrate these groups, when to accept temporary shelter, and when to remain independent required careful judgment. Miscalculations could lead to betrayal, resource strain, or unwanted attention from Roman patrols. Spartacus's ability to assess these risks and opportunities demonstrated not only military insight, but also keen social and political acumen, an understanding that the rebellion's success depended on navigating human relationships as much as battlefield tactics. As the rebellion continued, Spartacus also faced the psychological strain of leadership. Unlike Roman commanders, he did not have the safety of status, training, or political protection. Every battle, every march, and every decision carried the weight of life or death for thousands of individuals. The need to balance aggressive action with caution, to inspire bravery without provoking recklessness, and to plan long-term strategy while reacting to immediate threats, created immense mental and emotional pressure. His resilience under these conditions became a cornerstone of the army's perseverance, reinforcing the idea that a leader's strength often derives as much from character and endurance as from technical skill. Moreover, internal challenges sometimes intersected with tactical considerations. For example, deciding whether to engage a Roman detachment in a risky skirmish had implications for morale, resource management, and the perceived credibility of leadership. Success in battle could elevate Spartacus's authority, strengthen loyalty, and boost morale, while defeat could trigger panic, dissent, and desertion. These intertwined dynamics required that every decision be evaluated not only for immediate military effect, but also for long-term psychological and organizational impact, a level of complexity that Spartan professional soldiers often did not face in the same way. Ultimately, Spartacus's leadership in managing internal challenges reflects a remarkable blend of strategy, empathy, and vision. His ability to maintain unity among a heterogeneous and often inexperienced force, to instill discipline without oppression, and to inspire hope amidst extreme adversity, was central to the longevity and resilience of the rebellion. Without these skills, even the most brilliant tactical maneuvers would have been insufficient to sustain the fight against Rome. It is this combination of martial brilliance and human-centered leadership that has cemented Spartacus's legacy as more than a mere military figure, but as a symbol of the enduring struggle for freedom and justice against overwhelming odds. Section 10. The Turning Points and Major Battles. As Spartacus's rebellion swelled in size and influence, the trajectory of the conflict began to hinge not only on the leadership and cohesion of his forces, but also on key battles that defined the momentum of the uprising. These confrontations were more than mere displays of military prowess. They were critical psychological and strategic turning points that shaped the course of the rebellion. Each engagement tested the army's discipline, Spartacus's tactical ingenuity, and the fragile unity of a force that had been forged under extraordinary circumstances. One of the earliest major victories occurred during the retreat through southern Italy, when Spartacus's forces faced a Roman army under the command of Praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber. The Roman strategy relied on entrapment, attempting to surround the rebels in a mountain stronghold and starve them into submission. However, Spartacus demonstrated extraordinary ingenuity by devising a counterplan that leveraged both the terrain and the mobility of his force. Using makeshift bridges and ladders, his men descended the cliffs at unexpected points, attacking the Romans from multiple directions simultaneously. This unexpected maneuver led to a decisive victory, not only securing the immediate safety of the rebels, but also signaling that traditional Roman tactics could be outmaneuvered. It was a moment that elevated morale and bolstered the reputation of Spartacus as a commander capable of turning seemingly hopeless situations into triumphs. Another turning point came during the skirmishes around Capua, a wealthy city in southern Italy. The rebellion had by then attracted a diverse array of followers, including escaped slaves from various regions and individuals seeking personal vengeance. While this diversity contributed to the strength of the army, it also complicated strategic decision-making. Spartacus faced the dilemma of whether to besiege Capua, risking attrition and potential desertion, or to bypass it in favor of more immediate gains. Ultimately, he opted for selective engagements, utilizing guerrilla-style tactics to harass Roman positions while avoiding prolonged confrontations that could weaken his force. These tactical choices demonstrated not only battlefield acumen, but also a deep understanding of logistics, psychology, and the limitations imposed by his army's composition. Perhaps the most dramatic turning point came as Spartacus's forces moved northward, threatening to leave Italy entirely. The Roman Republic, alarmed by the continued success and expansion of the rebellion, dispatched multiple legions under different commanders, each with substantial resources and experienced troops. The confrontations that followed were large-scale battles, often involving tens of thousands of men on both sides. In these engagements, Spartacus showcased innovative formations, employing flexible phalanx-style arrangements, combined with flanking maneuvers that exploited gaps in Roman lines. His ability to read the battlefield, anticipate Roman reactions, and adapt in real time allowed his smaller, less formally trained army to win successive engagements, further inspiring loyalty and fear among friend and foe alike. Yet not every turning point was victorious. Over time, the increasing numerical superiority of Roman forces began to weigh on the rebellion. The appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus as the supreme commander brought a disciplined and well-coordinated strategy to counter Spartacus's movements. Crassus implemented a combination of entrenchments, fortified camps, and psychological warfare. gradually tightening the noose around the rebel forces. While Spartacus continued to demonstrate brilliance in maneuvering and fighting, the scale and organization of the Roman legions began to pose challenges that even his ingenuity could not fully offset. Each subsequent engagement required not just courage and leadership, but also careful calculation to preserve both manpower and morale. Another turning point involved internal debates among Spartacus's lieutenants regarding the ultimate objective of the rebellion. Some favored attempting a full-scale invasion of Rome, seeking to leverage momentum for maximum impact, while others argued for retreating to the Alps to disperse and secure freedom individually. The decision to move northward, although initially successful in avoiding entrapment, eventually exposed the army to more coordinated Roman opposition. This illustrates how strategic turning points were often intertwined with political and social considerations within the rebel ranks. Decisions were not solely tactical, but deeply connected to the shared vision and aspirations of those involved. Spartacus also demonstrated an acute understanding of morale as a decisive factor in battle. Victories were often amplified by the psychological impact on both rebels and Romans. By consistently choosing engagements where his forces could exploit Roman overconfidence or misjudgment, he created the perception that his army was invincible. This perception was crucial in sustaining cohesion among followers, many of whom you're fighting for personal liberation rather than professional military objectives. Conversely, when facing setbacks, Spartacus employed immediate regrouping strategies, retreats with minimal casualties, and inspirational speeches to prevent panic and maintain discipline. The battles themselves were brutal and taxing. Unlike the structured formations of Roman legions, Spartacus's army relied on a combination of improvisation, speed, and sheer determination. The rebels often constructed improvised weapons, utilized local terrain, and coordinated ambushes that capitalized on surprise and mobility. Cavalry units, largely composed of freedmen who had experience with herding animals, proved instrumental in reconnaissance and rapid strikes. In these confrontations, leadership extended beyond Spartacus alone. Subordinate commanders had to make critical on-the-spot decisions, creating a dynamic battlefield environment where adaptability was essential for survival. Finally, the turning points of Spartacus's campaign were not just measured in terms of victories and losses, but also in their broader symbolic significance. Each successful engagement challenged the perception of Roman invincibility, inspired hope among oppressed populations, and signaled the potential for dramatic social upheaval. Conversely, Roman counteroffensives reminded both rebels and the Republic that no movement, however inspired, could succeed without strategic planning, discipline, and endurance. These pivotal moments illustrate the interplay of military skill, leadership, human motivation, and historical circumstance that defined one of the most remarkable uprisings in ancient history. Through these battles and decisions, Spartacus's rebellion became a story of both extraordinary tactical success and tragic limitations. The turning points reveal a leader and an army navigating not only the external pressures of an overwhelming enemy, but also the internal complexities of maintaining unity, morale, and purpose under extreme conditions. They highlight how history often hinges on moments of courage, insight, and decisive action, moments where ordinary individuals confront extraordinary circumstances and, in doing so, leave an indelible mark on the historical record. Section 11. Roman counterattacks and the struggle for survival. As Spartacus's rebellion continued to grow in size and audacity, the Roman response escalated correspondingly, evolving from a series of isolated engagements to coordinated, large-scale counteroffensives. The Roman Republic, alarmed at the unprecedented scale of the slave uprising, realized that conventional punitive expeditions were insufficient. Instead, they mobilized multiple legions under capable commanders, whose strategic objective was not merely to defeat the rebel forces in battle, but to dismantle their growing network, disrupt supplies, and crush the psychological momentum that had elevated Spartacus's army into a symbol of resistance. This period became one of intense pressure, both on the battlefield and within the ranks of the rebellion, testing the leadership, adaptability, and resilience of Spartacus and his lieutenants. The appointment of Marcus Licinius Crassus marked a turning point in Roman strategy. Unlike previous Roman commanders, Crassus approached the rebellion with meticulous planning, emphasizing entrenchments, fortifications, and methodical pursuit. He constructed a series of defensive ditches and ramparts across strategic passes, seeking to restrict the mobility of Spartacus' forces and channel them into predictable avenues of attack. These tactics directly challenged the very advantage that the rebels had cultivated over years of guerrilla-style maneuvers. Spartacus, who had previously relied on surprise, speed, and terrain familiarity, now faced an opponent capable of anticipating movements and limiting options, creating an environment of heightened danger and complexity. The Roman counterattacks themselves were multifaceted, combining frontal assaults with flanking maneuvers, intelligence gathering, and psychological operations. Crassus employed a mix of seasoned legionaries and auxiliary forces, ensuring discipline and coordination on a scale previously unseen by the rebel army. The Romans also made effective use of intelligence, capturing scouts and defectors to gain insight into rebel positions and plans. Spartacus's forces, while highly mobile, were vulnerable to infiltration and surprise due to their increasing size, the diverse backgrounds of their members, and the challenges of communication across a growing army. Each counteroffensive required the rebels to adapt quickly, reorganize units, and make split-second tactical decisions, often under intense pressure and with limited resources. One critical aspect of this struggle for survival was the issue of logistics. Spartacus's army, initially composed of a few hundred escaped slaves, had grown to tens of thousands of people, including men, women, and children at times, and relied heavily on foraging, raiding, and capturing supplies from Roman depots. This expansion created both strength and vulnerability. While the numbers allowed for larger engagements and intimidation of smaller Roman detachments, the need for sustenance, weapons, and equipment became a pressing concern. Roman counterattacks often targeted supply lines and local resources, forcing Spartacus to make difficult strategic choices between maintaining the integrity of the army and preserving the initiative in the field. The psychological dimension of the conflict was equally significant. Roman legions were trained, disciplined, and steeped in confidence in their supremacy. Yet repeated defeats at the hands of what they considered an irregular and disorganized force created frustration and urgency. Conversely, the rebels' morale fluctuated with victories and losses, their loyalty tied not only to survival, but also to the hope of freedom and the perception of Spartacus as an extraordinary leader. Crassus understood this, employing tactics intended to intimidate and demoralize the rebels, such as displays of captured comrades and strategic positioning that suggested overwhelming strength. Spartacus countered by inspiring speeches, visible acts of courage, and tactical ingenuity. But the psychological toll of constant pursuit and the ever-present threat of encirclement weighed heavily on his army. The period of Roman counterattacks also highlighted internal pressures within the rebellion. The rapid expansion of the army brought together individuals with diverse motivations and experiences. Some fought for vengeance against slave owners, others for the promise of freedom, and some simply followed the strongest force in the region. These varying priorities occasionally led to disagreements over strategy, retreat, or risk-taking. Spartacus had to balance these internal dynamics while simultaneously facing an increasingly organized and relentless Roman opponent. This dual pressure of external threat and internal cohesion became a defining feature of the rebellion's latter stages. Several engagements during this period underscored the deadly combination of Roman discipline and rebel resilience. In some battles, Spartacus's forces managed to turn ambushes and terrain advantages into decisive victories, temporarily halting Roman advances and enabling the rebels to regroup. In others, Roman legions executed carefully coordinated assaults that inflicted significant casualties, demonstrating the challenge of confronting a professional army with a predominantly irregular force. Each encounter tested leadership, adaptability, and the ability to maintain order under extreme stress, revealing the stark realities of survival in a conflict where strategic miscalculations could lead to catastrophe. Ultimately, the Roman counterattacks signaled the narrowing of options for Spartacus. The strategic containment, coupled with the relentless pursuit of Roman legions, created a scenario in which the rebellion's mobility, the very element that had been its greatest strength, was increasingly constrained. Supply shortages, the exhaustion of troops, and the psychological strain of continuous engagement began to accumulate. While the rebels continued to fight with remarkable skill and determination, the combination of Roman military discipline, strategic planning, and numerical superiority slowly shifted the balance. In analyzing this phase of the rebellion, it becomes clear that the struggle for survival was as much about strategy and psychology as it was about combat. Spartacus's leadership, the cohesion of the rebel army, and the ability to make quick, tactical decisions were tested to their limits. The Roman counterattacks demonstrated the formidable capacity of the Republic to respond to existential threats and emphasized the complexity of confronting both an agile, unconventional opponent and the challenges inherent in maintaining a diverse coalition of forces. This period illuminates the interplay of power, resilience, and strategy, offering insights into how extraordinary individuals navigate seemingly insurmountable challenges in the pursuit of freedom and justice. By the end of this phase, the story of Spartacus is no longer just one of rebellion. It is a narrative of survival under extraordinary pressure, a testament to leadership, courage, and the human spirit's ability to adapt to overwhelming odds. The Roman counterattacks defined both the tactical landscape and the moral stakes of the uprising, setting the stage for the climactic confrontations that would ultimately determine the rebellion's fate. Section 12, The Final Battles and the Collapse of the Rebellion. The climactic phase of Spartacus's rebellion unfolded as the gap between hope and despair narrowed, and the Roman legions, under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, executed their final, relentless campaigns. By this point, the rebellion, which had swelled to tens of thousands of men, women, and children, faced the combined pressures of strategic containment, diminishing supplies, and an increasingly disciplined Roman military force. The final battles were defined not only by the skill of the combatants, but by the stark contrast between the tactical ingenuity of the rebels and the methodical, unyielding efficiency of the Roman army. These confrontations revealed the ultimate fragility of even the most determined uprising when confronted with organized state power. Crassus's strategy in the final campaigns emphasized containment and attrition. Rather than immediately seeking open battle, he constructed extensive fortifications designed to trap Spartacus's forces and limit their mobility. Ditches, walls, and earthworks cut off escape routes and allowed the Romans to anticipate rebel movements. These fortifications were not merely physical barriers, they were psychological tools, signaling to the rebels that the net was closing and that any misstep could be fatal. Spartacus, aware of the encirclement, was forced to reconsider his tactics, transitioning from aggressive raiding to a delicate balance of offensive maneuvers intended to buy time, protect non-combatants, and maintain morale within his increasingly strained army. The battles themselves were characterized by desperation, courage, and remarkable tactical acumen on the part of the rebels. Despite being outnumbered and facing a professional army, Spartacus continued to employ guerrilla strategies, using terrain, surprise attacks, and rapid redeployments to challenge Roman formations. The rebel forces demonstrated an extraordinary ability to adapt, sometimes turning the tables on Roman legions and inflicting substantial casualties. These moments of tactical brilliance, however, were often temporary reprieves, as the sustained pressure of Roman forces eventually wore down the insurgents. Each clash brought casualties, exhaustion, and the heavy emotional toll of seeing comrades fall, factors that slowly eroded the cohesion and fighting capacity of the rebel army. The Roman response, meticulously planned and executed, highlighted the contrast between disciplined military organization and the passionate but heterogeneous rebel force. Crassus divided his legions to cover multiple escape routes, coordinated simultaneous attacks, and exploited intelligence gathered from scouts and defectors. These measures ensured that Spartacus could no longer rely on mobility as his principal advantage. Roman formations, disciplined in march and battle, engaged the rebels in ways that limited their freedom to maneuver and reduced the effectiveness of their unconventional strategies. The relentless pursuit forced the rebels into confrontations they might have otherwise avoided, creating attrition and reducing their numbers steadily over time. One of the most dramatic episodes in this final phase was the battle in the southern region of Italy, near the Bruttium Peninsula. Spartacus, realizing that retreat to the north had been cut off by Roman fortifications, attempted to break through the Roman lines in a decisive engagement. The rebels fought with ferocity, attempting to punch a path through the legionaries and secure a route to freedom. Historical accounts describe moments of intense combat, with both sides sustaining heavy losses. Despite their bravery and superior numbers in certain segments of the battlefield, the rebels could not overcome the cohesion, discipline, and tactical positioning of the Romans. This confrontation marked a turning point. The rebellion's strategic options were now severely limited, and the final outcome became a matter of time. The collapse of the rebellion was not merely a result of battlefield defeats. It was also influenced by internal pressures. Within the rebel ranks, the cumulative stress of months of continuous conflict, scarcity of supplies, and the fear of encirclement created fractures. Differing priorities among the leaders, fatigue among the troops, and the difficulty of maintaining morale in the face of relentless Roman pursuit all contributed to a gradual erosion of unity. Spartacus, while an inspiring and capable leader, faced the impossible task of preserving cohesion under conditions of overwhelming adversity. Every decision became a balance between survival, morale, and the hope of escape. The final moments of the rebellion were marked by tragic heroism. Spartacus, understanding that the rebellion's momentum had reached its limits, continued to inspire his troops, urging courage and unity. Contemporary accounts suggest that he fought at the forefront, leading charges and rallying soldiers in the midst of battle, embodying the very spirit of resistance that had defined the uprising from its inception. Yet, even as the rebel forces displayed extraordinary valor, the strategic advantage had decisively shifted to the Romans, and the collapse of the rebellion became inevitable. The systematic Roman attacks, combined with the exhaustion of the rebel army, ensured that Spartacus's forces were gradually overwhelmed. The aftermath of the final battles was grim and calculated. Roman discipline extended beyond the battlefield, with widespread crucifixions and public punishments designed to serve as a warning to any future insurgents. Survivors were enslaved, executed, or subjected to harsh penalties, underscoring the severity with which the Roman Republic treated rebellion. Spartacus himself disappeared from historical records at the conclusion of the rebellion. While his death in battle is widely accepted, the precise circumstances remain uncertain, contributing to the enduring legend that surrounds his figure. The final battles, therefore, were not merely military engagements. They were transformative events that reshaped perceptions of power, freedom, and resistance in the ancient world. The collapse of Spartacus's rebellion demonstrates the interplay of leadership, strategy, and the harsh realities of confronting a powerful state apparatus. It highlights the remarkable human capacity for courage, ingenuity, and resilience, even in the face of insurmountable odds, while also illustrating the limitations imposed by organizational structure, resources, and military discipline. This period serves as a testament to the complexity of social conflict, the dynamics of insurgency, and the enduring human fascination with those who resist oppression against overwhelming force. Spartacus's final stand, marked by extraordinary bravery and strategic skill, remains one of history's most compelling narratives of rebellion, sacrifice, and the relentless pursuit of freedom.